cheap and abundant energy. Recording in progress, good. One was cheap and abundant energy, and there's heaps of coal lying around. Basically, that gives people an incentive to find ways to use it, but it also creates the sort of entropy reversing cycle that the thermodynamic nature of the economy is. We're creating improbably useful things out of rather more probable structures. The other reason, I think, is freedom. The Northeast wasn't necessarily much freer than other parts of the UK, but the UK in the early 19th century was a very free place to be an entrepreneur, much freer than France or Germany or any of these other much more top-down countries at the time. And what kind of freedom? The freedom to do trial and error, particularly, the freedom to experiment, to be wrong, to fail, to start again. The respect for the entrepreneur that had arisen in 17th, 18th and 19th century Britain, quite distinct from quite a lot of continental countries. And it's that freedom that I think is also the key to understanding China. Now, that might seem a very paradoxical thing to say about a dictatorial, authoritarian communist regime. But if you look at the Deng Xiaoping reforms, what he essentially said was, as long as you don't do anything innovative in the political space, you can get on and be jolly free in the economic space. You can start a business, you can invent a widget, you can be off to the races in a very short space of time, because all the layers of regulatory bureaucracy that get in the way of an innovator in the West are simply not there, as long as you're not annoying the Communist Party. And of course, you're taking a huge risk in that you might get your business confiscated or whatever. But as long as you're not doing that, you can start much quicker. You can get to earning results much quicker. You can experiment pretty freely. So in essence, the lesson from China, I think, is economic freedom works. Now, that's come to an end. I think Xi Jinping is a very different creature from his predecessors. He is clearly cracking down on the digital economy and a lot of other parts of the Chinese economy and trying to turn it into a much more directed and Maoist organization. And I think he'll kill the goose that lays the golden eggs in that respect. But I think we learn the wrong lesson from China if we say China got successful because it picked winners, it had a very specific industrial strategy about deciding which technologies to go for, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that is the right way to read China. I then wanted to segue quickly to biotechnology, and there is a China connection. The government announced this week, George knows about this, he was involved, I'm sure, in the announcement, that gene editing will be allowed for experimental purposes in plants in this country. It's good news. It's quite ridiculous that we have been unable to do this extremely safe, extremely sensible technology. I mean, of course, it can be non-safe, but so can any technology. At the moment, we produce most of our crops for food by irradiating them with gamma rays and other mutagens, and scrambling their genes randomly. This is about going in precisely taking out a little bit of DNA. But it's not nearly bold enough as an announcement from my point of view. There's a huge opportunity, having left the European Union and the ridiculous European Court ruling on biotechnology and gene editing in 2018. There was a huge opportunity for us to say, right, we're going to be the European country that does this. And we've said, but we're not going to do animals yet. Now, that's a real pity, because just up the road from here is the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh, which made a huge breakthrough a few years ago, Bruce Whitelaw's team, when they found that you could remove a small section of DNA from one gene in a pig, from a portion of the gene that is not found in other mammals. You take that little bit out, and the pig becomes immune to a really nasty disease that kills pigs all over the world. And nothing else happens to the pig. It's completely fine. It's completely healthy and everything. All you're doing is taking a little bit of DNA out. You're not putting anything in. I mean, you could do this in such a way that you leave a little bit of new stuff in, and a lot of people would do that, but they chose not to do it that way. Genus, a British company that breeds livestock, took this, it funded this work and it took it up and it's commercializing it, and it is getting rapid approval for this pig in China, in Mexico, in the United States. But the prospect of doing it here is still distant and a long way off, because I don't know why. Because somewhere there are there are politicians and journalists and people saying, "Ooh, remember what happened 20 years ago? People objected to genetically modified crops, so we should be careful now." Well, I'm sorry, A, the public's moved on, and B, this is a much simpler version of the technology and shouldn't be judged by the same results. Now, why I'm sounding a little bit passionate about this is because, and here's a slightly, not supposed to do this, but it's a slight preview of my next book, which comes out in 2 months' time. You contrast that, the fact that we're not even allowed to take a bit of DNA out of a pig to make it, to improve its welfare, to make it immune to diseases. Contrast that with what we now know from a leak a couple of weeks ago, that an organization called the EcoHealth Alliance was asking the Pentagon for funds to do in a city called Wuhan in China in 2018. And that was to take bat viruses closely related to SARS, swap their spike genes, goose them up so that it would grow in human cells in the laboratory by making chimeras of them, goose them up even further by introducing a so-called furin cleavage site into them, and using them to infect so-called humanized mice with human genes in, so that the lungs of these mice could be infected with these viruses, so that they could study these viruses with a view to heading off the pandemic that might come from one of these viruses. So it's a perfectly reasonable goal, but it's an unbelievably more risky experiment to be doing. Something's gone terribly wrong in our society. Oh, and by the way, just to be clear, SARS-CoV-2 is the only SARS-like virus we've ever found, including its very close relatives, including its 97% close relative that was found in Laos a few weeks ago. It's the only one with a furin cleavage site in. And putting furin cleavage sites into viruses to make them grow in the laboratory is quite a common habit in virology labs. And they were planning to do it to these kinds of viruses. So that doesn't prove that that's what happened. We still need to get in and find out what did happen. But the point is, how have we got ourselves into a situation where we're not even allowed to do an incredibly safe project on a pig, but we're doing extremely dangerous projects on viruses? I hope that's a provocative enough way to start the conversation.
Brilliant.
Sorry, I've got way off the topic of innovation in the Northeast, but we'll come back to that because there's some great questions.
No, it's absolutely fantastic, Matt. It's brilliantly provocative. There's a load of questions pouring in, and I think let's crack through them. I'm going to try and group them into pairs, I think, on the sort of similar theme. Let's start with Tim Cowan, Radix Fellow. Interesting question about competition and big tech, and should we break up the big tech platforms? Tim first, and then Gisela Stewart on have we got the incentive regime here ambitious enough for innovation? Tim, are you there, Tim?
I can read out Tim's question if you'd like.
Yeah, is he there, Georgie? No.
We don't know because he might be called George Freeman.
Oh, okay. Well, I have got his question, which is, he says, scrolling back to it, do you agree with the need for reform of competition law to allow, in line with the EU and the USA, allow us to take on big tech platforms and promote innovation? I think it's the kind of, should we be disrupting the big platforms? And Gisela, I think, Gisela, are you there?
Giselle, I call her.
Giselle.
She's next
Giselle
to you.
Is there.
Yes, I am here. Thank you.
Do you like Giselle or Gisela? I can't remember.
Giselle.
Giselle.
Great questions. Somewhat above my pay grade, probably both of them. But yes, we have got to do something about competition in the digital space. The old sort of Reaganite idea that as long as monopolies are driving down prices, then you don't need to worry too much. It's only when they then try and jack them up once they've got a monopoly that you've got a problem. That idea is fine for a lot of price-related things, but it doesn't work for this information point. The notion that Facebook and Amazon and others have this extraordinary stranglehold on the conversations we're allowed to have, on the way in which information flows around the world, has to be reformed. Now, I want to do that without destroying these organizations, because I think they've also brought enormous communication benefits to the world. You know, I'm not here to say that they're all evil or anything like that. But just to give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, I just told you a little bit about the work of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the notion that that might have been where the pandemic got started, I'm not saying it was, we've by no means proved that, but the notion that it might have been is now being at last taken seriously and is being properly debated. I was just this afternoon watching a very good debate at the American Academy for the Advancement of Science on exactly this. And that wasn't possible. That was possible on Twitter for the whole of last year, and some very crucial people found some very crucial information buried on the Chinese internet that has been absolutely vital to understanding this debate. And they communicated with each other on Twitter, and the rest of us were eavesdropping. But on Facebook, if you even tried to discuss the possibility that this virus started in a lab, you were censored. How can that be right? That can't be right. Now, what they were trying to do was stop nutty conspiracy theory, anti-vax stuff spreading. And there I kind of agree with them. But, again, who does the censoring? It's a very difficult question. And the only way to get it right, in my view, is to have more competition, to have more variety of sources, so we can have, so that we're not preventing maverick ideas that are right from getting out there, but we're not providing a megaphone for maverick ideas that are wrong and dangerous. As for Giselle's question about, is the UK's incentive regime ambitious enough to drive investment in innovation? No, I don't think it is. I don't think you can ever be ambitious enough in this space, frankly, because innovation is the source of all prosperity. It's the reason countries get rich in the first place. The more you have of it, the better. I'm staggered by how little talk about innovation there is in Parliament, for example. People like George and me are an exception in that respect. If our incentives were 3 times as good, we'd have 3 times as much innovation, and we'd eventually get 3 times as rich. It's that simple. Now, of course, you then get into the problem that if the incentives are tax or regulatory or financial, then there are downsides, there are competition issues, there are possible risks, et cetera, et cetera. So, it isn't quite that simple. But yes, we should be thinking hard and furiously about how to turn ourselves back into the country that spawned the Industrial Revolution. And I think we've got a good chance to. I mean, America is not particularly interested at the moment in being, I've just seen a gray squirrel outside the window, sorry. America is not particularly interested in being the most dynamic economy in the world. China, as I say, is turning in on itself. Europe has been extraordinarily bad at encouraging innovation. The job of 21st century tiger is vacant. Someone should grab it.
That's my job description, Matt.
There you go.
Fantastic. Okay, next question. Saba, are you there? Great question on the next technology shift.
Yes, hello, hi. I work in, hello Matt, I work in the defense industries, obviously looking at a lot of AI, robotics, sensing technologies. But how do you get ahead of the innovation and keep ahead of the next technology shift, especially when shareholders and people like that are looking for ROIs and shareholder value, etc.? How do you maintain that momentum?
Yeah, well, getting ahead of innovation is not easy because it's an amazingly unpredictable thing. Well, it is and it isn't. One of the things I'm fascinated by, and I write about in my book, is that the fact that there's something horrendously inevitable about certain innovations happening when and where they do. And the best example of this I give is the light bulb. 21 different people basically invented the light bulb independently of each other all around the world. There was Swan here in the Northeast, there was Edison in America, there was Ladygin in Russia, and so on. And so it doesn't matter what you do, the light bulb's going to come along. And that makes it, the reason is obviously because the technologies that contribute to inventing the light bulb are reaching a point of ripeness where it's sort of inevitable that it's going to happen. Same with Moore's law, incredibly predictable. So you could bank a business on the fact that your computing technology would improve dramatically in the next 2 or 3 years, and you could do that for 50 years. That's what Moore's law. That's how long Moore's law worked, and therefore you could, like Steve Jobs, stand up and announce a product that you couldn't yet make and be confident you get there. Fake it till you make it is the phrase that they used in Silicon Valley for that kind of thing. But notice that when Elizabeth Holmes tried the same trick with the miniaturizing of blood testing, she eventually, not before raising being worth $9 billion, Theranos, her company, because she's currently on trial in the US, fell flat on its face because Moore's law wasn't happening to microfluidics, if you see what I mean. So there wasn't a predictable trajectory. And actually, I think that predicting which technology is going to take off next is extraordinarily difficult. For a start, it's non-linear. It surprises us. I often make the point that the first half of the 20th century was dominated by innovation in transport, and by 1950, everybody's predicting incredible future changes in transport, routine space travel, personal jetpacks, all that stuff. None of it happens. Basically, transport stops changing for 50 years. In my lifetime, jets have hardly changed speed. They've got a bit safer and there's more cup holders in cars, but apart from that, transport's been a dead duck compared with computing and communication, which hardly changed at all in the first half of the 20th century, but went through incredible changes in the 21st century. So if we sit here now and say the next 50 years is going to be the last 50 years and it's all going to be about AI, we might be badly wrong. We might actually be overestimating the degree to which the current trends will continue. The focus might shift to something else.
Could it be having a portfolio of experimentation, rapid experimentation? That might be the way to go in terms of where you hedge your bets.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't stress enough how writing a book about innovation and collecting stories about it, the theme that came through again and again and again was trial and error. Jeff Bezos made a string of catastrophic errors at Amazon again and again and again, and he boasts about it on his way to making the biggest company in the world. He says, if you're not swinging and missing, you're not swinging enough. I believe that's a baseball metaphor, but I don't really understand it.
There's a great theme in there. My subject, although David Cameron used to introduce me as his pet scientist, I kept saying, I'm not a scientist. I read history and philosophy of science, very different. But one thing that always fascinated me was the accidentalism of science, particularly British science, actually. We've never been terribly good at, the French do it, the Germans have done it, the Americans quite well, pouring lots of money into big labs that'll find the answer. British scientists, I think, Matt, you'll back me up on this. I mean, we've got a brilliant history of sort of observational, accidental, creative thinking between disciplines. And we're particularly good at that. And we haven't been very good at the structural sort of big backing of big winners.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, the other theme that I think we forget about British science is how extraordinarily good we've been at biology compared with other countries. Whether it's evolution or DNA or the first cloning or test tube babies or DNA fingerprinting, we've punched way above our weight in biology, and we've never really done the same in physics, for example. And maybe that's a sort of, the British empirical tradition. You just you're not trying to find grand laws. You're just trying to play with the world and see how it works.
Yeah. Okay. 2 questions on education and innovation. Siobhan, are you there?
Yes, I am here, George. Hi.
Hi.
So yeah, so many of questions what you're saying, Matt, and good evening, by the way, kind of feed into my question. You know, your point that innovation isn't part of our natural vernacular. Why do we do so well in biology and not in physics? And it kind of takes me back to my question that is it not sown as a seed within us from an early age? George will often talk about the culture, having the right culture and environment to spark and then be a catalyst for innovation. I suppose my concern, as both having worked in education and being a parent, is that, is innovation surely not a skill set we should be channeling and showcasing the benefits of from a very early age? And so that, George talks about, the skill set of tomorrow needs to be developing today. And do you think that the education of today, with its focus on exams and skill sets and league tables, is crushing that? We hear that music and the arts are being squashed and no longer prioritized. And if yes, how do we get that back?
Can I pause on that, Matt? Because there's another question linked. Wendy has a good question about overcoming the fear of innovation. Wendy.
Yes, I think it's not only innovation. I think it's basically ideas that make those of us who don't understand the grand ideas. I sit here as someone who understands probably very little of what's being said this evening, but it's people like me who can hold that sort of thing back. And people like me, if we do understand, can help to take it forward.
Brilliant. Let's take those together, Matt.
Yeah. Well, I arrived in Oxford University in 1976, and my first term, one of the professors who was going to teach me published a book. The book was called The Selfish Gene. His name was Richard Dawkins. Of course, it became hugely famous. That book blew me away. And the reason it blew me away was because it said to me, I'm going to take you on a journey through a mystery. And I'm going to show you what I don't know and don't understand. And I'm going to suggest to you that there's some really fascinating stuff out there. But hold my hand and come with me, because we're going into the unknown. It didn't say, as every science book I'd read up until that point said, here's a catalogue of facts that you need to know. And I can't believe, looking back on it, how my school science education was simply taught us, these are the things we know for sure, those are what you need to know. Instead of saying, the whole point of science is that scientists are interested in the things they don't know, the things they don't yet understand, the mysteries, the enigmas, and trying to solve them. And so somewhere in the education system, challenging people to say, you're not entering a complete world, a finished world, a world in which we know everything, a world in which we know how to run it. You're entering a world in which is going to change fast in your lifetime. Things are going to be invented, things are going to be innovated, and they're going to change the world, and you could be part of it. And by the way, well, I would like us to do more to tell the heroic stories of inventors. I think, I'm much more interested in stories about inventors than I am generals or something like that. But I also worry that when we do talk about innovation, we talk too much about invention rather than innovation. We talk about the original prototype rather than the hard slog to turn it into something that's affordable, reliable, and available, which is a much more collective effort. We sometimes, we use words like creativity, which I think are quite dangerous because they tell kids that there's a sort of special blood flows in the flow of some people. Some people have got it and some people haven't. And there's no point in trying to be an innovator because, Steve Jobs is a bit of a god, or, whoever it is, Isaac Newton was a genius or something like that. And I think a lot of the stories of innovation is how it was quite ordinary people who did it. People who just knew the importance of learning by doing, of experimenting, and so on. And who, all you got to do is just do a lot of trial and error, and you might end up contributing to an innovation. And every innovation is not a solo effort, it's a collective effort by lots of people sharing. So that's what I would say if I was stood up in front of a class of GCSE kids. I suspect it would throw them off their exam results pretty badly. So it's just as well that I don't get the chance to do that.
Is that not saying that not to be afraid to fail?
Yes, that's a very important lesson of innovation. I mean, perhaps saying to one's children, "Don't be afraid to fail your exams," is not an ideal strategy, but in the sense that an illuminating failure is much more interesting than a boring success. Yes.
I'm reminded, Matt, of I can't remember whether you were able to make Big Tent 2018 at Babraham campus, Cambridge, and I wanted to go there for two reasons. It's a proper science park rather than a car park, which is what most of them are. It's got a beautiful Jacobean house, mature trees and woodland. I mean, it's a beautiful place. It's a sort of place where an apple might fall on your head and lead you to think a bit about what makes the world go round, with these phenomenal labs and this incredible ecosystem. But we deliberately put the arts tent next to the science and technology tent. And a number of people, including Ferdy Mount and Harry Mount, both commented on it and said, that's fascinating. And one of the things that we were trying to highlight is musicians, even if they're sort of rock and roll stars and swinging the guitar around, they are actually incredibly skilled technicians. They are playing an instrument. And entrepreneurs and scientists are also very creative. And that I understand you're worried about that word, creativity, but we're trying to sort of get the idea that there's a discipline. And if you've got a bit of discipline and you apply it creatively and asking the question, as you were describing, then that's the same instinct really to make to change the world.
Well, in my book, I have a section about how restaurants innovate, about how menus are innovated by chefs, and it's a really interesting topic. There's been some fascinating stuff written about it, but it's there's a lot of trial and error in it, as you can imagine. But there's also a lot of serendipity. There's a lot of it's very like the way Silicon Valley operates, as it were. Yeah.
On a previous Meet the Leaders, David Cleveley, founder of Raspberry Pi, he made a really interesting observation that, of course, the valley, the Silicon Valley that we know now, back in the 60s was hippies, and that there's a countercultural element often in innovation clusters. And of course, in my part of the world, in East Anglia, the most expensive bits of real estate in Aldborough and Burnham Overy and Burnham Market were actually in the 20s and in the Depression. They were the places that artists went because they were cheap. So there's something about regeneration. I think the government needs to just think a bit about the role of art in creating insurgent creative places where people can think the unimaginable. So we've got a couple of questions on that. Let's begin the move towards public sector and then government and sort of the Northeast. Paul Goldsmith, great question. Paul, over to you. And then Sarah Shuckett on whether we can get more scientists into Parliament. Paul.
Yeah, so can you make the public more innovative? And so related to the public sector, I suppose also academia, which focuses very much on success of the individual rather than collective effort.
Great question. And Sarah, are you there on Parliament and scientists?
Oh, sorry, actually, it was Saba again.
Sorry, Saba.
Yeah. Yes, no, it was me. And my question was, well, surely we do need more parliamentarians who are scientists, engineers, and technologists, because then it's so critical for creating that societal shift. But there's another element in that when we sell off companies like ARM, for example, that critical chip manufacturer, we're actually selling off a strategic national asset and capability. And that's happened to a number of companies. And I think it's really important to understand what sort of companies we need to keep together. And I just think it's a useful skill. There aren't enough parliamentarians who have that background.
Two really good points. How do you make government more innovative? I think it's fascinating how bad government is at innovating about its own processes, and there are quite good reasons for that. You know, you build up traditions of parliamentary democracy over hundreds of years, and you disturb them at your peril. And I, going to work in the House of Lords as I do from time to time, reminds me forcibly, that essentially I'm walking into a sort of 18th century, if not a 17th century operation, where we use florid language and we tie ribbons around scrolls of paper, and we see wigs on the clerks and things like that. The only innovations on view in the chamber are the iPads that we're all reading our notes from, which have come from outside government into government. And it's not that dissimilar when you deal with the civil service. You find traditional ways of holding meetings and minutes and blah, blah, blah. The sort of innovative ways of working are seeping into government, but from the private sector on the whole, rather than the other way around. There are one or two case histories, and they're rather illustrative of government suddenly rousing itself and innovating its own processes. There was a guy called Mike Bracken in the Cameron government who was in charge of gov.uk, the sort of digitization of the interface between the public and government. And he had some pretty bold ideas about how not to do big IT projects. Don't do them in a waterfall fashion where you get everything ready and then you suddenly unveil it on day 365 and it crashes. You pilot it, you roll it out in small incremental ways, etc. And he basically got away from the appalling record of IT disasters in government IT, and he set up the whole gov.uk operation, which was and you still see it actually, is remarkably simple and uniform and works quite well in terms of navigating your way around the British government websites. So that was quite smart, but even he found it very frustrating, he and Francis Maude, his champion on this project, that the civil service very quickly closed, the water closed over their head as they left, and old practices were brought back and things like that. There was real resistance to some of the sort of digitization things he was trying to do. More scientists in Parliament, wouldn't that be nice? I know. I mean, lawyers. Oh, sorry. Some of you are, I'm sure. They're great people. Lawyers. Actually, no, they're wonderful. Watching brilliant legal minds at work in the House of Lords is a treat, actually. But there's plenty of them, is my point. There's some very good doctors in the House of Lords, but there's not many scientists. I mean, people like Martin Rees and people like that, John Krebs, who used to teach me. But I think, given the importance of science in our culture, and even more given the importance of innovation, so entrepreneurs, it would be nice to have more of them in Parliament too. But above all, it would be nice to have people with experience of the real world in Parliament, and that's, I think, less true than it used to be. Most people have, most in the Commons, most people are now professional politicians who've started out as special advisors and then moved into some other government job and then become MPs. I think that's a pity. I think we do need to get back to people who are I can count on the fingers of two hands the number of people who are really interested in tech in the House of Lords.
Yeah, I'm reminded now when I first arrived in Parliament, someone saying to me, "I give you two bits of advice. In the Conservative Party, I would absolute kiss of death if you're badged as intelligent. I mean, that's the absolute last thing anyone wants. Absolutely terrified. And secondly, for goodness sake, don't show any expertise, because that will terrify everybody, and you'll never end up being allowed to apply it." And I think that's the thing I'm most happy about in this job, is I've been put in a square peg in a square hole. And Parliament, in my experience, and governments have been terribly bad at using the expertise. I mean, the Wits Office never look at anyone's CV and say, Williamson, I see you you have a history of this. Let's try and use those skills in the right place.
Right. Actually, just to give one story, by far the parliamentary occasion of which I'm most proud of having been involved was when the mitochondrial replacement therapy measure came first to the Commons and then to the Lords. And it turned into, and obviously the excitement of this was partly it happened at the Centre for Life, which I was president of, and I'm suddenly forgetting his name. Doug Turnbull was the professor who was doing it, and it was a very important piece of moral, ethical, and scientific issue to discuss. And I was involved in lots of meetings for parliamentarians to hear people about this before the debate, and then when it came to it, it was a big set piece debate. The chamber was crowded, which it often isn't in the Lords, and people like Naren Patel, the brilliant obstetrician from Scotland, led the sort of argument on our side, and I came in behind him, and basically we won the argument. That was what was so exciting. We had no idea which way the vote would go, and we won it 6-1 in the end. And so, it can happen that you get a good scientific debate in Parliament, but it's not very often.
No. I make this observation as well. I remember when we set up Genomics England to sequence the genome of 100,000 NHS patients. I felt very strongly in 2011, for goodness sake, don't set up a quango. We'll spend 3 years legislating, and the opportunity to smash the cost of genomic sequence and take a lead will be gone. Let's create a company, have the Secretary of State own the only share, and start on Monday, which is what we did.
Great.
I've arrived in government. I'm now responsible for ARIA, the great innovative space science agency, which is grinding its way through Parliament. And it's 18 months, and we're not even through yet. And the opportunity is drifting out of our hands. And I think a more innovative state is a fundamental sine qua non of our being able to kind of get out of debt and harness this opportunity. Now, there are a few more questions.
By the way, there's one from John Goddard that was in the list before.
Yes. John, are you there?
Yeah, hi, I'm there. Yeah, it's this issue about, I suppose it's really topical now because of levelling up, and the place of science in all that agenda, and how you, Matt, sort of, and particularly George as well, seeing government, sees this emerging. Because my question is around the extent, and it relates to your last point, Matt. Big government can get in the way of the levelling up agenda because it's not responsive enough to local opportunities, local needs, the creativity that is place-based. So how do we get around having a much stronger territorial view on how you can be innovative from the bottom up, not just only by science, but getting scientists working with the community, with social organizations, getting science out into the innovation process in small businesses, in public organizations. So it's the whole issue about science and levelling up, and what views you have on that, Matt, and maybe George.
Well, again, I don't pretend to have thought terribly hard about this. I think George will be much more interesting on this, and I'll let him answer it as well. But a couple of observations. This country is horribly centripetal. The pull of London on almost everything is very strong. We far too many of the things that were once done by local government are now done by national quangos based in the south. And that has had the effect that, career-wise, you head to London if you can at some point in your career, and it's just stifled the growth of local initiative. And this isn't a political point. This has happened under Tory governments and Labour governments alike. So we've got to find a way of reversing that. And I think done rightly, the mayor agenda might be able to achieve that. I mean, if you look at what Ben Houchen's doing on Teesside, he does seem to be championing the right kind of innovation and investment for that part of the country. But I think we also oughtn't to be afraid of competition between regions. I think there's a sort of terror of postcode lotteries and of, letting things be different in different places. I'd love to see regulatory competition. Come to Cumbria because we allow biotechnology or something. I mean, I just made that up at the top of my head. It might, that might be a disastrous idea, but do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Why don't we do that? Given that we haven't got any money, so we can't pour money into these. Well, we have got money, but it's not as much as we thought.
Well, we pump a lot of money into science.
Well, exactly. So my point is, we've sort of tested to destruction the subsidizing of technology and things in different regions. I don't think there's a lot more we can do there. We probably need to do some of it, but regulatory competition, tax competition, etc., seems to me something we shouldn't be afraid of.
John, can I'll just follow that up. I agree with Matt. This is sort of chosen a specialized subject. If I wasn't in government, I'd be writing a book on this subject right now. And it seems to me that those places that are left behind, and that was another question Paul Bell raised the interesting point, Matt, is that phrase left behind, the self-defeating phrase that it reinforces in the poor people of windy pit villages in County Durham, that they were left behind and can never come back. But my own view is that there's clearly a kind of disconnection thing there, and that some connectivity, making it easier for people to connect, is really important. But a shiny train alone, or even a hydrogen bus alone, isn't going to do it. It's also about disempowerment. And that's why I completely agree with you. I think the mayors have been quite transformational. The challenge then is, how do you get that level of leadership in a smaller town that wouldn't justify a metro mayor? There's something else, I think, which is about the skills and the education level. One of the reasons County Durham struggled is that it used to vie with Norfolk for being at the bottom of the county education league tables.
Yep.
If I tell you that in Norfolk, hold on to your seats for this one, folks, 50% of our secondary schools in Norfolk cannot get 5 C grades GCSE. Now, how are we ever going to build an innovation economy like that? It's true, you don't have to be, not everyone has to be a boffin. There are jobs for forklift drivers and pallet managers, but even in today's warehouses, being a forklift driver, being a pallet manager, being a refrigeration man, you need some skills. And if we're really failing on the schools agenda, then we'll never do it. But my own view, John, is in the end, the Treasury mistakenly thinks the economy is one thing, a spreadsheet in the building, and that actually the economy is hundreds of thousands of clusters of people and agency doing deals.
Absolutely.
And to me, if we created some regional regeneration corporations, I mean, if you formed a company called the County Durham Development Corporation and allowed everyone there, including possibly the local pension funds, to put a bit of money in it, gave them some tax breaks and said, you can keep half the savings if you can do things better than government, and keep half the extra growth if you can grow the economy quicker, I think we'd see a new generation of people saying, I don't want to be an MP. I want to be the Joe Chamberlain of County Durham. I want to put something back. And I was very struck last week how many entrepreneurs there are now who've sold their businesses, not for hundreds of millions. But there's a lot of people I met who've sold their business for 3, 4, 5, 10 million. And they want to put something back into the area they love. The last thing they want to do is go to London or hand it, So I think there's an opportunity to really unleash and harness some of that energy in the new economy locally. Let me just ask Paul Bell, are you there?
I am, yes.
You had a good question about whether levelling up is a self-generating and self-defeating term.
Yeah, we hear this quite often, and I'm from the northeast. I was born and educated in County Durham. I'm a partner in an international architectural practice which was founded in Newcastle, and we're very proud of our region. And I do think that when you continually hear these references of left behind, I said self-fulfilling, you said self-defeating, and there is a danger there, and I think there's a lot to be proud of. And when I bring people to the region, they're surprised, and I think they're surprised because there is this perception that it is a left behind region, and the old thoughts are still there, and it doesn't represent what we are.
Yeah, brilliant question. And let's tag that with Roy, Professor of Aging at Newcastle. Are you there?
Yes. What would you like me? Which question would you like, George?
It was the one about the Northeast's core competencies.
Oh yeah. I'm interested. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Hello, Roy. Nice to see you again.
It's lovely to see you too, and thank you very much. In this context, it's always best, in my opinion, to build from strength. And in the context of the Northeast, it's an interesting question to ask, something that would be asked in a business, by the way. What are our core competencies? Or indeed, in the case of the Northeast, what are our natural benefits? Yeah, and here I'm thinking about natural environmental benefits. Thoughts?
There you go, Matt.
Yeah, both really good points, and completely. I don't disagree. On the one hand, the anything you do to single out a region and say that it needs help is going to be stigmatizing. So I suppose we can't help whatever phrase we use becoming a stigma and becoming a bit of a self-defeating prophecy. In one sense, but I think, like you, Paul, I have friends who come to the Northeast with extraordinarily warped perceptions of what they're going to find, and it's quite fun seeing the scales drop from their eyes. I mean, I remember picking up a minister at the station and driving past dance studio in Newcastle, and oh, you have dance here in the Northeast, the person said. I won't say who it was. I could have punched him or her, but I didn't. There is, let's weaponize our chip about this kind of thing when it's helpful, and sort of make the point. And it actually sort of feeds into Roy's question a bit, because actually there are pockets of stuff where we're doing way better than other regions. And one of them in a way is disposable income. I mean, if you're in the Northeast on the same wage as someone in London, you've got twice the disposable income, I suspect. And that results in opportunities of an interesting kind for people. So, but another is, as Roy hints, quality of life. The living within reach of the Cheviots, the Durham Dales, and Hadrian's Wall, and the beaches at Warkworth and Ambleton seems to me a no-brainer. If I wouldn't live anywhere else, etc. And that's a wonderful opportunity. But you get this crops up on the sports pages, doesn't it? When Newcastle in the old days, doesn't happen anymore, but they used to buy a posh player sometimes, and the player's wife would sort of say, "Hang on, I'd rather be on the King's Road," so they'd be sold to Chelsea in a flash, and that it feels like that. We've got it's a real struggle to fight the pull of the capital in that respect. And I'm not quite sure what one can do about it. But I think Roy's got a very good point that we're not a big enough region. No region is probably big enough to do everything. And some things need more of a critical mass of population than we've got. And we'd be mistaken if we tried to be that. And we're not going to suddenly become San Francisco overnight or something. So let's specialize in certain. Let's not be afraid of specializing. Let's I mean, Charlie Holt, I thought, did a great job. He came to me and said, look, do you know that Lord Mayor who runs the Institute of Civil Engineers? Because there's a real strength in civil engineering software in the Northeast. And let's go and tell the London-based Institution of Civil Engineers about this, which we did, and we had a very interesting seminar about it. And I think that's the way to go, is to spot these pockets where a region has developed a speciality and a particular strength, and tell the rest of the world you've got them.
Matt, I got two last questions. We could go all night, but gin and tonics are beckoning, and you know, all good things have to come to an end. Two great questions that I think bring this round really nicely. Ben Brabin on the role of risk capital and regional stock exchanges, regional banks. Is it possible for us to spread the genius of the City of London in a more productive way around the country? Ben, over to you. And then Sam Olson, a great question on China again and the investment they're making in 700 national laboratories. And what should we, I think he means I, as Minister for Science, Innovation, and, you know, how to use a much smaller amount of money here in the UK to really make a difference. Ben.
Thank you, George. I guess really this is a question which is perhaps a little related to your point about the regional development corporations. The genius of the City of London, of course, is really an expression, a concentration of the genius of regional risk capital, which, you know, the golden age of innovation in the 19th century saw stock exchanges in every major and quite a few minor conurbations. Can we learn from history of this? Is there a way of returning some of that risk capital closer to the source of the talent that needs it?
Matt.
Yeah, well, Charles Parsons was Irish. He came to the Northeast to start his turbine manufacturing business, partly because there was cheap energy here, but mainly because there was a lot of capital here. There was a lot of local wealth looking for entrepreneurial investment. So I've read. I don't know if it's true. Somebody can probably put me right on that. But that wouldn't have been in the form of a stock market. It would have been in the form of, I guess, what we'd now call angel investors to back his business. And yes, that does seem to be lacking. It's just unbelievably tough now to build up, you know, to raise 15 million quid for a startup in Newcastle compared with London, say. And I mean, you know, I've seen this at first hand. I chaired Northern Venture Trust, Northern 2 Venture Capital Trust, sat on the board of Northern Investors for a long time. It would be wonderful to find a way to get that, you know, get that whole equation going again. I'm not convinced that regional stock markets are the answer. I even wonder if stock markets have had their day, that there are so many other ways of doing investing, and public markets are now so sort of overrun with rules and regs that it doesn't, you know, it's not the best way of raising money. So I think it's more about venture capital myself, but I wish I had some better ideas.
Sam, you had a good question about China, going back to Matt's point earlier on.
Yeah, hi. So I've actually worked a lot in China and a lot around innovation, and I've written widely about Chinese innovation and a lot of the myths surrounding it. For example, incremental versus radical innovation, which I'm sure, Matt, you know a lot about. But one of the things that China does get right, in my opinion, is the fact that they put so much money into the infrastructure of innovation. And I mentioned about 700 national laboratories, but there's so much more to that statistic that meets the eye in terms of the amount of money they put into the universities. In the Nature Top 100, 25 of the leading up-and-coming universities for innovation, of the top 25 are all from China. In fact, the top 50 are all from China. And what this makes me think is, what are we doing in the UK? And I don't want to be too accusational on the government, but just in general terms, what are we doing to provide that infrastructure backbone for innovation across the nation, not just in the Northeast, but in every part of the four nations? Well,
really good point. And again, George Freeman or someone else on the call will know how to answer that better than me, because I'm not terribly up to speed on the sort of details of UK investment in this kind of thing. But I suspect it's partly also that the Chinese investment goes into, as it were, innovation rather than discovery, into development rather than research, as well as research, I should say. And I think that the UK government has shifted the emphasis here in the last 5 or 10 years towards that sort of thing. I mean, the focus of Innovate UK, of the catapults, of all this kind of thing, is very much on saying, don't just discover something, develop it and commercialize it as well, and we'll try and hold your hand as you do it. I think the UK is doing that much better than it used to, and much better than most of its continental neighbors, but nothing like as well as China or the west coast of America yet. But that's a very superficial perception, and I'm happy to be corrected by somebody.
I'm smiling, Matt, because 13 days into this job, across my office is a whiteboard with my mission. Left-hand side is the science engine, which is, we spend a lot of money, and I think it's a bit bureaucratic, clunky, UKRI and my department bays and the research councils. There's a lot of paperwork and a lot of signing off on. I want it to hum like a Formula One engine and put money into the best labs and into the best people. They're either winning a Nobel Prize or pulling in a lot of industry investment. And the innovation ecosystem, we've got to stop floating companies at 20 million so the Americans can buy them and float them back at 200 million on NASDAQ. And I genuinely think we've got an opportunity post-Brexit with some of the regulatory freedoms to really go back to where you started at the beginning and create a new real industries, clusters in hydrogen fuel, in AI, in cannabinoid medicines, in gene editing, which are not all in Cambridge. They're all around the country. And I'm really fired up. I think we've got an exciting opportunity to do it. And boy, do we have to, because people are waiting. They've been very patient. As have you all. Matt, I'm going to hand us all back to Ben. And just, Matt, thank you very much. It's always a joy. Thank goodness you're here. When I get depressed, folks, down my end of the house, I go up and see Matt, and he reminds me that we're in a noble endeavor. And part of our mission is the big tent.
We were having coffee, and he kept checking his phone. And of course, the reshuffle had started.
Matt said, "Are you sure you're going to get a job?" And I said, "No, I'm not, but it's a decent outside bet." And the key thing really is we want to take this conversation around the country with a big tent. And Coventry this year, we had, Matt, a brilliant leadership summit on the Friday. 100 of the shakers and makers in Coventry, from teenage entrepreneurs setting up nightclubs and digital clusters of gaming through to the people on the front line of public sector. And on the Saturday, a festival, and hundreds of people came to celebrate Coventry's history of regeneration. And what we're trying to do is take the big tent around the country and stimulate those conversations. So thank you so much. Ben, over to you.
Just before, if I can hold you for just 2 minutes more. Firstly, can I just add my thanks to George and Matt for what was a brilliant conversation and just so full of ideas, not, if I may say so, exclusively from you, Matt and George, but from everybody participating in this discussion. And that's really the strength of Big Tent. 4 years ago, Radix published this paper, which you probably can't see, but it's how the Bank of England transferred money to the wealthy without clear democratic accountability. And at the time, it was sort of really a bit nutty, or regarded as a bit nutty, the challenging of the independence of central banks. It's now, post-quantitative easing, very much a core discussion going on around the world. And that's what Radix is, to make those sorts of debates move into the mainstream. That's us having an impact. We published the paper that became Common Market 2.0, the proposal for one way of moving forward with Brexit. And I'm not asking you to necessarily agree with either of these suggestions, but what we can do with Radix and with Big Tent is contribute and shape the debate and change the debate. And it's what Big Tent is doing, which is why I'm so excited by working with them, by taking discussions like this around the country and demonstrating back to government how we can change debate. And I want to ask everybody on this call now, you've been verbally part of it, I want you to invest in our discussion. And I think that probably everyone in this call is capable, if you so choose, of becoming tonight a friend of Radix Big Tent. You can do it. You'll see that the link has been placed in the chat. It will be put there again by my colleague Georgie. And that will enable us to take these discussions around the country. We're in Coventry earlier this year, as George says. We've got plans for the Northeast. We've got plans for the Southwest. And this idea that there are 100 different economies out there shaping what Britain can be, and you can be part of it. Please help us by becoming a friend tonight. And thank you again to Matt and George for a brilliant discussion, and to all of you for making it so. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.